Project risk matrix. And a lot of you have already turned those in, and most of you have scored really, really well. The one exception to that I noticed, or one item I see, and several of them that I have looked at, is because spell check doesn't work necessarily that great inside of Excel. There have been a lot of spelling and grammatical weird. So double check and look at those before you turn them in, because it does take away that professionalism if you misspell they or simple words like that. So it's easy to do. I do it all the time. So.
I have a question for the risk classification.
Okay.
For that, could there be like a category for financial risk?
There can. If you want to add, if you see another risk, these really, I have a lot of flexibility in how I'm looking at these. I want you guys to think about different risks. Different companies are going to have this organized slightly differently depending on what kind of risks there are. But what we're trying to do is get you forward thinking about what kind of things are a risk and what can happen and how they change over time. So it may be the same risk, but your response will change over time. So again, I kind of like to think about that car example where if you think a car, now granted building a car is not a project, it's an ongoing operation, but the same term applies. If that risk is different at the beginning before it's built versus on the assembly line versus delivering it to a customer, how those risk levels are. Yes, Justin?
What would the responsible timeline be?
So who is responsible? So who actually manages that risk and what kind of things are you going to do? And then so the timeline of that project, when in that timeline of the project does either the risk happen or does your response happen? So how are you going to handle it and when is it going to occur? It could be multiple people, and usually it is multiple people. But so you're just trying to identify those risks and try to come up with that idea of how do I solve them, and then you can use that scoring to figure out which risk is most critical, because now you've multiplied the probability times the risk factor, and you say, all right, well now I have one that scores a 4.2 versus one that scores a 2. You can certainly take a look and say those are different. JC. You can do 1 through 100. You can do 1 through 5. I don't really care what scale you do. I tend to use, if I'm doing one for myself, I tend to use scales that are equal. So I will use 1 to 100 for the risk and 1 to 100 for the probability. So it just gives me a little more granularity. The scale in there, if you just used 1 through 5, that's a real quick classification, and you can do that also. So you can look at it in terms of dollars. I'm trying to get you guys used to that idea because I'm guessing none of you have at this point created this risk matrix. And you can use these in your own lives even when you're going to go out and do something. When you're looking at, many of you are looking at grad school, you can actually do something very similar, and you can look at potentials of what's going to happen if I go to grad school, what is that going to impact, how am I going to deal with moving out of state, for example. And so you can use these kind of techniques all throughout your life and in projects and in teams and things you're involved in. So it just gives you that focus point. And so whether you use 1 through 5 or 1 through 100, you're going to end up with very similar results. So you're targeting a solution that will be there. So this week we have a lot to cover really, really quickly. And so I have borrowed liberally from this guy in the past. And in fact, if you notice, I put in a couple links in week 6, including this great resource I just called it. And that's actually Dr. Pankey's site. And in fact, it's got an assessment. So if you're curious, he's actually built a PMI assessment that's got 100 questions you can do. And he's got a lot of material about project management in there. So I threw in that as a link, and I have borrowed some of his slide shares because he does a really nice job of going through and getting the highlights in about 20, 25 slides, and that actually works really well. So this week, again, we will not have a lecture or class on Thursday, just to make sure. Usually I'll put that up, and then still somebody will email and say, hey, how come there's no lecture today? Well, that's why. You are going to have to do the discussion board this week. So in a blended class, depending on how we can do the discussion, this one's a little different because it's a blended and an 8-week hybrid, so we have to somehow get to that 135 hours in 8 weeks, or my estimate of 135 hours in there. So when we speak about projects, that's one we're actually looking at. I'm on the assessment committee, and we're looking at how do we make courses equal in rigor in terms of number of hours you spend on them. So the average course, if you're just curious, we should have, by the Carnegie model, which is kind of how the national push is coming down to us, 135 hours of content in a course. So your reading materials, tests, quizzes, all of that count towards that, and class time. And that's kind of how we come up with that number. If you've been in a live class and somebody has said, well, you're going to spend 2 hours outside of the class for every hour you spend inside of it, that's kind of how we arrived at that model of 135 hours. But when you look at an 8-week class, what does that end up for a number of hours you should be working on a course in 8 weeks? Too many. It's about 17 hours a week. And so how do we document and prove that you guys are actually doing that? And I know that all of you really are doing 16.59 or whatever number that is. So just another little project sideline for you. So we're going to talk about, really quickly, the idea of project procurement, and we're going to look at stakeholder expectations and how we manage those. So project procurement. So when I say procurement, we're procuring things. So it's products, services, people, or results, or outside things. So we are trying to get things from outside of our team. Our team, we already will know that they're going to give 100% and give us all their resources. But now we need to acquire other items or other services. And how do I do that? And we've already talked about how that project manager doesn't have referent power. In other words, they're not given the keys to the castle. So we know that we need to figure out a way to do that. So if we create a plan, it's that, again, that documentation of how we make purchasing decisions. So different companies have different processes for ordering things. If you've been at the college, and I know a lot of you guys in here have actually worked in different offices, the college has purchasing plans and different models we have to do. How do we identify potential sellers of the product? How do I go about buying the products? So for example, at Peru, over a certain dollar volume, over I believe it's $5,000, we have to push out what's called an RFD, request for documents, and we have to get multiple vendors to all bid on the same item. And we have to then pick essentially based on that, did they meet the quality and the requirements we wanted, and did we pick the lowest cost? So we have to justify that. So different companies may have different cutoffs. There are some companies I've worked with where a manager can blow out $25,000 on a personal signature without consulting with anybody. There are other companies where a $100 purchase would require an override or a vote. So we need to figure out how our company works. We need to look at those items we need to purchase. What kind of management plan do we need from them? So we may need to come up with things over here as a bid document. We may need to get a statement of work. If we're hiring somebody else to do something for us, that statement of work that says this is exactly what they're going to do. We may need to get other estimates. We may need to go outside to do that. We may need to find a vice president to sign off on things, or however our organization works. So included in there, we look at those things. So you're doing that risk register, and one of those risk items is always relying on somebody else. Think about a team you've been on writing a paper. You take a risk in relying on somebody else to write that opening paragraph, right? The same way if I'm hiring somebody else to code my software or to build my road or whatever it is I'm hiring them to do, I'm taking a risk. So all of those documents are going to get updated. Our milestones, hopefully our lessons learned, we can see what's happened in the past. And that may include, we realize that we got a low bid from Joe Blow Contractors, but we look back in the lessons learned from other projects and we say, hey, they bid and got the award for projects previously and they did not deliver on that award, and we could then disqualify them from our bidding process. So that lessons learned gets really important in this procurement phase when we're trying to figure out how to get resources. So there's a lot of different types of contracts out there. And so some of these, when you hear the term, so at our cafeteria, we're gonna throw out a term for what they do. And they are doing what's called a cost plus contract. All right. So whatever it costs to provide food for the campus, they do at a percentage, then they increase right on top of it. Is there any incentive for them to save money? So cost plus contracts tend to be the last resort if I cannot find any other kind of vendor. Why would Peru be in that situation where we have to do a cost plus? Does anybody want to come down and provide us food on a reasonable cost? No. Now, there are some limits on there. Obviously, we're not having filet mignon every night over there, right? I've eaten at the cafeteria. It is not filet mignon. But it is a type of contract. So, common ones you're going to see. So you'll see that cost plus, generally that last resort. If I have to bring in an additional contractor to get something done, sometimes I have to do those cost plus contracts. So you see a lot of times you'll see a time and materials. And so in your contracts course, and I still think they do in business law, you have to do contracts. Am I correct? Yeah. So you'll see a time and materials contract. So that one's pretty common. A firm fixed price. So there's another term that I've seen recently or more frequently, especially on construction projects, and it's called a guaranteed maximum price. So in other words, we agree on a project. So where I have seen this is in building some hospitals and some other construction projects like that, where the contractor agrees to a maximum price of, let's say, $32 million. So the contractor then, the more that they can squeeze out of that project, the better off they are, right? So that they have a firm fixed price and they're going to deliver the hospital as the documents require. The one exception to that is if we run into something called a change order, and we've talked about that a little bit. So if we require a change order, then that will change that contract at some point. So if we did a guaranteed maximum price to overhaul this building, and then we run into something that is not in the contract, so maybe they have to put in additional structural steel, then that would be a change to that. So there is this fixed price initiative fee. So they give a fixed price plus if they get it at a certain metrics, and usually those are time-based metrics. So is the theater up and running yet? No. What was the original timeline on the theater? August. So if we had used a contract of a fixed price with an initiative fee for getting it done by August, they would not get the bonus, right? The other side of that is, I have seen contracts that are very similar to this, but not only do they have an incentive fee, but they have a penalty cost also. So in telecom, we did a lot of those because we needed to have things done by a certain date. We had made an agreement with US West or CenturyLink or whoever it was, and if we didn't get that fiber turned up on a certain date, we actually paid per day, and in some cases it was fairly expensive. I think one contract was like $1,500 a day that we would pay as a penalty off of the price. So there's all different kinds of changes to these. So contract management in a lot of projects is really a full-time job. You're managing that. A lot of times you'll have some legal advice because it does get a little ugly. So fixed price with economic price adjustments. So if there's certain things that happen in a project, and so this is a lot of times used on software. For example, during the project we may know that there's going to be changes at the quarter or 6 month time, and we can actually change then how that contract looks. So we set it up in advance, but we know that at certain times that contract's going to change. This is not all of the contracts that you can find. You're going to find there's other ones out there. These are kind of the most common. And again, the other one that's really common is that idea of cost plus. Ooh. So, cost plus an additional fee. Ooh, we don't want that. This is that contract of last resort. Anytime we say cost plus, that means that generally we've been unable to create a contract in any other way. So whatever it costs to build, whatever it costs to finish, we're going to do that. So they may call it an incentive fee depending on if we can get it done at a certain time. So one of them I got involved with as a construction work company was have any of you been to Jacksonville, Florida? Yeah, all right. So there's a great big river in Jacksonville, right? Called the Jacksonville River? No, I don't remember. It's a big river, and we were doing what's called hydraulically directional drilling, which you guys are all like, I don't, that makes my head hurt. In other words, we were going to pull a pipeline underneath the river for about 3,000 feet. So that takes a lot of equipment. It takes a lot of man hours. It takes a lot of all kinds of other things. We ran into the Department of Environmental Quality and had some marshlands that were set aside for some birds. And we had a contract with AT&T to do this project. The original contract was for a set price per foot. And so this was going to be about a $300,000 build originally. That's still a big chunk of money, but the equipment we had, the directional drill alone, was a couple $1 million we had sitting there. And then all the ancillary equipment and people and pipe and the whole schmeal. So the other companies that had been across there just laid their cables on the ground, and every time they would dredge out the shipping channel, they'd get cut. So that was the incentive for that. AT&T said, hey, you know what, go ahead and do it. We don't care. We'll make it a cost plus. By the time we were done, we were well over $1 million for that particular build. And then they backed out and said, you know what, we didn't really think it was going to cost that much. And we actually ended up in court, so it got a little ugly. So it's one of those ideas of make sure you get that all documented. Now, we had memos of understanding from AT&T vice presidents that that's what we were going to do, and yet they still tried to back away. So from both sides, these contracts can get kind of ugly, especially when it flips to this idea of cost plus. So part of what our issue was, or their issue with us, was we didn't inform them all along how much more we were spending every month we were there, because this ended up about a 6-month endeavor to get this actually done. So make sure that everybody is aware of what's going on, especially on those fixed costs, because if the cost increases, you can get burned fairly easily. So you have to come up with a plan in your project documents. So a couple of things. What kind of contracts are risk management, again, what you're working on right now, how we are going to get those prices. So are we just going to get independent estimates? Are we going to put it out for bid? What kind of documents do we need to actually start purchasing? If I need multiple vendors or procurement agents, how do I handle that? What other things happen inside of my company? Do I need to coordinate this with other projects? What kind of lead times? So if I'm building or using something that's very odd, I may have a lead time. So think of building a hotel. If you're using non-standard furniture, those furniture makers are going to take a while to build that furniture for you. And so you're going to have to come up with a plan for that lead time. And you may have to change some of your methodology or your plans based around that. And you may end up saying, well, you know what, let's go with standard furniture because it's available. And so you need to take those things like lead times in advance. There is also something we tend to call the make or buy process. And you guys probably do this on your own. So the reality is, sometimes we do that. And if you've ever worked on your own car, has anybody done that in here? And you did that because you said, you know what, I can probably fix my car for less than a mechanic. And you looked at it and you said, so you made that decision to do that in-house versus outsourcing. So here's an example, just kind of an example about what we're going to do. So what's the minimum number of months the company needs to use the excavator in order for it to make sense to buy this excavator than to rent it? So often in construction, we rent equipment rather than purchase it because we think that it makes sense. So the company would have to pay $105,000 for an excavator, but you're also going to be at about $10,000 a year in maintenance costs. So the price to rent the excavator is $5,000 per month with a one-time service charge of $2,000. So what's the minimum number of months the company needs to use the excavator in order for it to make sense to buy it rather than rent? Now, those of you that are accounting majors already are thinking, hey, what about depreciation and all these other things? But right now we're just looking at that in terms of cost. So what is my total cost to buy that excavator for 1 year? What's my upfront cost? What's it going to cost me to buy that excavator? So that's at $105,000. How much is it going to cost me in maintenance? So $10,000. So in 1 year, so if I look at it in just 1 year time, it's $125,000 for that excavator. Now, that doesn't take into, I'm assuming the $10,000, we're saying it's fuel and everything else. So you're at $115,000 per year. Whereas if I rented it for that year, if I rented it for a year, I'm $5,000 per month. So 5 times 12 is 60, I hope. And I have a $2,000 charge for a service charge. One time. So over 1 year, I'm at $62,000 or I'm at $115,000. Are we missing anything in our assumption in there? Or are we missing a lot of things? So when I rent something, it just goes away, right, when I'm done. If I own that, I can probably still sell it. But we're just going to take it for just kind of looking at that. So I have a couple of options in there. And so I know right away it's way past 16 months, isn't it? Yeah, just looking at those numbers, I can see that it's going to be past that. So in fact, I'm probably going to look at this and go, well, let's see what happens at 21 months. So 21 months at 5,000 happens to be 105,000 plus 2K or 107,000, right? Does that make sense? So at 21 months, it's 107,000. What's going to be the answer on here? On this particular question then? What if I look at it at 25 months? 25 times 5 is 125,000 plus 2. So until we get to that 25-month mark, then it becomes cheaper to buy. Now again, we're leaving out a lot of things with, cost of interest and all of those kinds of things. But you're looking at that idea. Do I need to buy this machine or do I need to rent that machine? And as a business, you may be making those similar decisions about software. Do I rent the software and a software as a service, something like Salesforce, or do I purchase it? And you can use those same techniques. You're essentially looking where those intersect to try to see where I would want to purchase or what I would want to do to it. So, we have a lot of documents in here. So this is one of the phases where we add even additional documents. So those procurement documents, bid documents, how did I come up with my sales documents? So an RFP, request for proposal, or a request for quotation. So you'll see those terms quite a bit. So you might want prices or a proposal. Once you decide and you pick a vendor and you've gone through a vetted process, then you have to come up with that actual document. And that document's going to have a lot of details in it. So one of them quite often that we have is how are any issues resolved in that document. So a lot of times we say we're going to base that on arbitration rather than court, and so you waive the right to go to court by signing that contract. One of them you'll see a lot. So you're looking at how do we agree on something, and very, very similarly, how do we agree to disagree? So what's the work? How are we going to do it? What's the time frame? All of those fit into that contract that you're going to have, not you necessarily signing, but probably the VP or CIO or whoever it is in that company. So different things that may be in there. So pricing, warranty, inspection criteria, payment terms. How are they getting paid? So what is the criteria for them to get paid? So when you build a house, for example, there are preset stages where that contractor gets paid, and a lot of times in other construction products. So when the house frame is done, they get a chunk of money. When it's what they call dried in other words, the roof and the siding and everything are on it, you get paid. When the drywall and the interior finishes are done, you get paid. So there's a pricing scheme or a payment scheme in place. How are we going to get rid of this clause or this contract? What are the ways that we can do that? So when you sign a lease, there's a way you can get out of your lease. So usually it's paying a huge amount of money if you've signed a lease on a house, right? So my stepson is trying to figure out how to get out of his lease. Doesn't like his roommate, has an issue. He can get out of the lease he's at. He has to pay 3 additional months' rent as a penalty. Yikes, he's paying $800 a month in Lincoln. I don't think he wants to do that. He's probably going to deal with his roommate for a while. So what are incentives, penalties, insurance requirements? What is a performance bond? So a performance bond is that item we take out. So if we can't do the job or your contractor can't do it, that insurance bond will pay for another vendor or company to come in and finish it. So you see those on construction projects all the time. Because if somebody can't build the road out here in front of the complex, hopefully that contract has a performance bond, and that will actually bring in a third-party contractor to do that. So during that, you also have to have some way to control this project. So we write our agreements. We also have to monitor that progress and control it all the way through there. So generally in there, so you'll see this term claims administration. So a lot of times this is what we're talking about, that third-party arbitration. And there are firms we can hire, and then sometimes we'll specify them in the contract document. We'll hire ABC Claims Administration to do this. And that way we have a third party, a hopefully neutral third party, that will negotiate any of those things that are involved in there and we have an issue with. So we have to have a contract change system. And so again, we want to take that out of the hands of that project manager. They may be involved in the process, and hopefully are, but you really want to move that into an upper division or a team or somebody else to take that away from you. So you will probably handle the paperwork going up and handle it coming down and do the negotiating, but that the actual decision is taken out of your hand as a project manager in most cases. Now, in some cases you end up doing it, and you always want to document and document and document and document. So there's a lot of tactics and things we can use when we are trying to work on these contracts. So you'll see that we use all of these. So withdrawal, arbitration, stalling, you're going to see all of those used in projects. That negotiation, that technique of negotiating that contract or negotiating that claims administration is really kind of an art. And if you're one of those people that likes to argue, why am I thinking of people in this class? Oh, sorry, Dolores. No, it really is that idea of you're going to get in the middle of that, and you have some techniques at your, tools that you can use. And so you're trying to always get a better position for yourself. So it really is an art of attacking. So there is an online quiz, and so this is interesting. That's why I linked to his site. There's a lot of different pieces in there when you look at it. So contract management is kind of an interesting field. And if you're one of those that likes details and likes to find those little nicks, go, oh, well, this wasn't included in the contract, that is a great field for you to look into. So you can be a project manager. You can work in the project management team. You can do the contract negotiations. And sometimes a company will have a contracts negotiator that will spread across multiple teams. In a lot of cases, they do look for people that have a legal degree because that can give you that edge when you're looking at those contracts. But it's an important and critical thing. When we use outside resources, we're taking a big risk that something can go wrong. And when it goes wrong, these are the people we have to deal with. Those stakeholders. Well, we're managing claims. We're managing the project. We're managing risk. We're managing all of these different items. We also have to manage those stakeholders. And so we need some tools that we can look at to see if we have some resources and some edge. This is one of the trickier. So outside vendors, we know that they're trying to make money. We have that. Stakeholders oftentimes have political reasons that they're involved or are a stakeholder, and it's not always positive. And so we'll take a look at a couple of these pieces. So stakeholders, first we have to do, identify those stakeholders. So way back when, we've already tried to identify. And then we looked at the term stakeholder engagement. Do you guys hear the word engagement here a lot on our campus? We try to engage you in different things. Well, you are trying to engage those stakeholders so that you keep them and utilize their talents, but also you're monitoring and managing them. So you're going to keep them involved in project decisions, execution, use them when you can, keep them out of there when you can't. So what we have to do is also figure out what a power or how involved a stakeholder or a group of stakeholders needs to be, or we want them to be, or we can allow them to be. Because if we allow all of the stakeholders to come into our project, they're going to essentially become the project manager, and that's not really what we want. So it's going to get a little ugly. So again, here's some of our outputs that you're going to see. We have that risk management plan. Stakeholder engagement plan starts to show up. And now again, we still have that issues log we're looking at. So there's a lot of different models out there for stakeholders. And so we're going to look at a couple of them. And a lot of them do this idea of a grid. And so the power interest grid, so how much authority do they have, and their level of concern. So we're trying to create a matrix that way. The power influence grid, which really is very similar. So we have how much influence they can have and how much power they can have. An influence impact grid. So again, we're looking at what their influence is versus what their ability to change that model is. A salience model, so how much they can impose their will. So we know that some stakeholders will have more power than others. So if we have a project on campus and we say, you know, one of the stakeholders might be the legislature and one of them might be the governor. Certainly it's a state project. If the governor comes on campus, he may be able to impose his will on a project, and we have to be able to deal with that. So we also have this idea of legitimacy. So even though the governor could impose his will, is it a legitimate reason he's doing something? And we'd have to look at that and see if that happens to fit. So this is one of those grids we're looking at. And so it's kind of easy. We can kind of say, all right, so the more power they have, so certainly the governor has a lot of power, but his interest in Peru, do you think the governor really gives a crap about Peru? Do you think he could even find Peru on a map? Let's be honest, no. So his interest, so power high, but his interest is low, so we just probably need to monitor what he's got going on. On the other hand, if suddenly the governor adopts a child and they go to Peru, or is he going to be more interested? Yeah, so we might have to manage him more closely. He's got high power, he's got high interest, and we have to deal with it. So this we can lump into different categories, and we can see where they lie and how much ability they have to disrupt your project. And disrupt not necessarily always in a bad way, but also in a positive way. And sometimes we can use these stakeholders in a positive manner also. So a lot of times we talk only about the negatives, but the reality is sometimes we can use those stakeholders as a positive force on our projects also, and we can get them involved. So, a stakeholder registry. So, name, who they are, roles, what kind of information do we need out of them? So their requirements, expectations, what kind of potential influence, and where do they land? So a couple of these make sense, external and internal. Are they a supporter? Are they neutral? In other words, they don't care about the project. Or we use the term resistor. And a resistor means they don't really want this project to succeed for whatever reason. So we have those a lot. So maybe a project is we want to allow alcohol at football games at Peru State College. We'd put up a beer vending tent. So we might have, oh, you guys suddenly are like, whoa, beer vending tent. You can tell the ones that have turned 21 now, and they're like, yeah, it's beer vending tent. So we decide that the alumni group is going to have a beer vending tent. Do you think the alumni group could make money at a football game selling beer? All right, so here's our project. We start going through there. So we're certainly going to have some supporters, right? And we'll probably have some people who don't really care one way or the other. They're assuming, hey, you know, the alumni that come back to campus are sneaking in flasks anyway. Wait, did I give away a secret on campus that's been happening for years? Yeah, dang it. All right. But you also, are you going to have people that are going to be resistors and who say, there should not be alcohol on a state campus, right? So you're going to be able to lump these people into those categories of supporter, neutral, and resistors, right? So those resistors you also have to work with and maybe sway them, maybe make sure that their influence is mitigated enough that that project can go on. So this is a great statement. Developing appropriate strategies to engage stakeholders throughout the project life cycle based on their needs, interests, and potential impact. These stakeholders can make or break a project, and often do. And especially when we're doing anything on state property, city property, those kinds of things, those stakeholders can be significant in their ability to influence that project. Because the other thing that we see, not so much in private business, but in this public business is, not only are we saying, hey, we want to have a beer tent on there, we're probably also trying to actively recruit dollars and funds in these projects, right? And so a lot of times somebody's influence can change from the beginning of a project to the end. So suddenly we have a donor who doesn't like our idea, and he's going to donate $300,000 to the foundation to shut down the beer tent. Is that going to have an impact on our project success? Yeah. On the other hand, we could have the other side. We could have a donor who says, man, I really like that, and I like beer. Here's $300,000. I think you should keep going. So being able to monitor and manage and plan for those stakeholders is critical for almost any project. In fact, all projects. So we need some tools. So now we're looking at that idea, that plan. So there is a tool here called the Engagement Assessment Matrix. And so you're going to see this one show up a lot. And so the engagement level of the stakeholders. So unaware. They don't even know if a project exists or impacts. So they don't know about it. They don't care about it. Great. That resistant. Well, they're resistant to change. And sometimes we even end up with the ones that just say, man, we've never done it this way before. And that's that idea of resistance to change. Neutral. All right. Not really swayed one way. Supportive. So they're aware of a project and they support it, but they're not active in it. But a leading engagement level is they're aware of the project, they're aware of the impacts, actively engaged in ensuring that that project is a success. So that's our guy that came to the beer tent and wrote a check for $300,000 for the alumni, saying this is a great idea. So he would also be the one that would go to the city council and testify that, you know what, we think the city ordinance should change so that the city could do that, and those kinds of things. So a lot of times we'll build a matrix like this, and notice there's two different letters on there. There's a C and a D. What do we think those might be? They were in your book. But what do you think those might be? Do we want to change people and how they perceive a project? So look at it in terms of current. So currently stakeholder 1 is unaware. Our desired role for that stakeholder, though, is supportive. There are stakeholders who, when we look at them, really don't have any power. And they may be unaware, and we can say, you know what, our desired status is for them to be unaware. It doesn't make any difference in the project. On the other hand, we may see some stakeholders that have a lot of power and influence. We say right now, they're neutral. But we'd like to change them to supportive. We may want to change somebody who's supportive to change them into a leading, because they have, maybe they're a retired politician and they have a lot of politicians that they know they can get in that door and do some legislative push. Maybe they have an in with a corporation that we're dealing with, and they have that ability. So these kinds of tools, not only are we looking at where they are now, but we're looking at how in our plan are we going to try to push them. Notice, we rarely would ever desire to have somebody resistive to our project, right? We try not to push them from unaware to resistant. If you try to push somebody to be resistant, you've got an interesting end game. So, that stakeholder plan. What kind of levels of engagement do we have current, and what kind do we have for desired? So, what information are we going to give these people in these groups? And we're going to usually identify those stakeholders into different groups, and they're going to get different levels of information. So what kind of requirements do they have? What kind of requirements in different phases of the project may they have? Because in different phases, we may have different requirements for feeding them information. So why are we giving them this information? What's the reason for it? Is that going to change them from a neutral or unaware to a supporter? How are we working that? What is the time frame, and how are we distributing information? How are we updating and refining this plan? So this plan isn't static. It can change. Everything in our documents is subject to change as we develop this stakeholder engagement plan. As we go along in our project and we start noticing things, so we have those issues logs, our changes logs, we may change that stakeholder plan. So, we are trying to manage those expectations, addressing issues. And issues with stakeholders can be interesting. Telling them, you know, I'm not going to talk to you until next week is probably not the way to do it. We can work out some ways to manage that. And so what you want to do is get that appropriate level that you have defined of stakeholder involvement. So they can be an asset. The resistors can be a problem, but we also are going to monitor and manage how we deal with resistors. And sometimes we can change their mind on a project. So if you think about a lot of community projects, think about building a pool or a splash park in a city. And one of the resistors we tend to have are those older voters, right? They go, well, I'm not going to the pool, and I don't have kids that go to the pool. But yet if you can show them that that is a good resource, students and kids are using it, for example, they can sometimes be switched to say, hey, that's maybe not a bad idea. They're off my lawn. I don't have to deal with them. So, other things you're going to have in there. So you're going to end up with things like change requests. I can think about those ideas of change requests also in terms of stakeholders. So changes to a project may involve the stakeholders, and I probably need to update them and deal with that. So you're going to have those issues logs, that lessons learned. Because hopefully you're not a one-and-done project manager. You get the ability to do these over and over and over again. Those change logs, those lessons learned, that what have I experienced is really the greatest thing in there. And the reality is, we learn more sometimes from our failures than we do from our successes. If everything comes easy in a project, the next one may be a bigger surprise because we don't know what could go wrong and what will go wrong. So we need to adjust those strategies as a project develops. The longer the project, the more we have change, obviously. That's just kind of a given. Very short projects, we may not change that stakeholder engagement, but that a process of monitoring it and seeing what's working. So maybe we have a lot of feedback from stakeholders that our weekly email just isn't effective, and we have to go to some other means to distribute that information. So I encourage you this week, go out and look at those 2 resources I found in there. Look at the site. There's a lot of videos in there about procurement management. How do we deal with those contracts? How do we deal with it? And there's a lot of information on those videos about stakeholder engagement. How do I manage? And it's an active process. It's not a passive. It's not the stakeholders all came by my building. How do I proactively get in front of those, especially those that are neutral, those that are unaware? How do I get them involved in this project and become that edge that leads to that supporter role for them? Because if I can get those on board, that tends to be a really, really great positive for my thing. So that's a quick object. Here is this tonight, and I don't know when this video will finish uploading, but remember tonight you need to make sure you have that risk assessment turned in. I think there were probably 8 or 9 of those that were already turned in. There was a quiz due last week, and I have not looked to see if everybody did that. So I will send out and look at that. This week there is a quiz and there is a discussion board. And again, this discussion board requires you to do a little bit of research. You have to go out and read a paper and look at a few items and try to get some takeaways on there. So make sure you construct all of those. So we will see you guys in class again then next Tuesday. And that actually is almost our last week, isn't it? We're in week 6 now. We have week 7, and then we have finals week for midterms. Isn't that amazing? It goes by so quickly. All right. Thanks, guys.